Bibliophiles of the internet, since we are well into July at this point, today I'm going to talk about my second quarter reading stats. I really enjoyed getting a chance to reflect on my first quarter reading back in April. That video, of course, will be linked down below, so I'm glad that I get to do it again now that the second quarter has officially passed. So let's get into it and let's learn some things. Starting off once again with the most basic and perhaps most important statistic, the total number of books I read in the second quarter. In the second quarter, I read 25 books. Now, it should be said that I did adjust my quarter one stats for race fakers. If you know, you know. So with that adjustment in mind, that means I actually stayed consistent between the first and second quarter, reading 25 books a piece in both quarters. So there's been no change. To break down that number a little bit further, I'll do a quick monthly overview for what I read in April, May, and June. In April, I read Something Kindred by Sierra Birch, The Haunting of Tramcar 015 by P. Jelly Clark, Winnie Nash Is Not Your Sunshine by Nicole Melleby, Womb City by Totlo Tamase, The Deep Sky by Yume Kitase, Mishadra by Yasmin Omar Atta, Squire by Nadia Shamas and Sarah Alfaghi, Celestial Monsters by Aidan Thomas, and The Story of the 100 Promises by Neil Cochran, for a total of 9 books. In May, I read Flawless Girls by A.M. Macklemore, Road to Ruin by Hannah Lee, You Should Be So Lucky by Kat Sebastian, Dear Wendy by Anne Zhao, A Magical Girl Retires by Park Sol-yeon, The Dawn Hounds by Sasha Stronach, and Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang, for a total of 7 books. And most recently in June, I read Fire Exit by Morgan Talty, Isabel and the Rogue by Liana de la Rosa, The Other Olympians by Michael Waters, Asunder by Kirsten Hall, The Fireborn Blade and the Bloodless Princes by Charlotte Bond, Rough Trade by Caterina Carrasco, A Taste of Gold and Iron by Alexandra Rowland, and Ocean's Godori by Elaine Yu Cho, for a total of 9 books. Moving on to reading trends, let's talk about my top 3 most read genres. For the second quarter, those were horror, which came in at 4 books, romance, which also came in at 4 books, and obliterating the field was fantasy, coming in at a grand total of 11 books. Keep in mind there is some overlap between genres here because some books can comfortably fit within more than one genre. I only counted a title twice if I felt like it truly fit in both respective spaces. In comparison to the first quarter, romance and fantasy remain 2 of my top genres. It is worth noting that last quarter I did count sci-fi and fantasy in one collective genre of SFF for some reason, but going forward I will be keeping them separate to be a bit more precise. And this is also the first time this year we see horror emerge as a top genre, and honestly I would love to see it stay up there for a little bit. Next, I want to talk about a new stat that I didn't talk about last quarter, but honestly I should have, and that's a new category I'm calling How Many Were Queer, in which I break down how many books I read in the past quarter were queer books. Unsurprisingly, I read quite a few queer books, 18 of them to be exact, and that means that out of 25 books total, queer books made up 72% of my reading. Now let's talk about reading format, going from least read to most read. This time around, ebooks were my least read format. I only read 4 books as ebooks. That is 16% of my reading overall, and compared to the first quarter, that's down 11%. Next, we have physical books, which comes in at 7 books read. That is 28% of my reading, and since last quarter, it's actually up 16%. And surprising no one, least of all myself, audiobooks absolutely dominated the second quarter once again, coming in at 14 audiobooks total. That is 56% of my reading, and compared to last quarter, it's actually 6% less. Honestly, I think this spread is pretty respectable. I'm glad that I read more physical books than last quarter, and I'm happy to see audiobooks be consistently at the top. It's just been what works for my brain these days, so if I see a high number of audiobooks read, that means I'm keeping my brain happy and that I'm also retaining a fairly good access to audiobooks. Now let's talk about audience spread, by which I mean the age range or age demographic the books I'm reading are targeted towards, which is pretty much exclusively either middle grade, YA, or adult. Sadly, this quarter I only read 1 middle grade book, which was Winnie Nash Is Not Your Sunshine. That made up a whopping 0.04% of my reading and is 1 less middle grade book than I read last quarter. Safe to say, there's some room to improve. This quarter I read 5 YA books, which makes up 20% of my reading, and that is the exact same amount as last quarter, so I'm keeping it consistent. And of course, surprising only myself, adult books absolutely made up the most of my reading this quarter. I read 19 adult books, which roughly equates to 76% of my reading, compared to last quarter that's actually up 4%. I said this last quarter, but I don't know why it's so weird to me that I, an actual human adult, read mostly adult books. And while that makes sense, while I don't have any bias towards or against any specific age range, I do at least try to read widely, and I do love middle grade and kid lit so much more than is being reflected in these stats. So that tells me I should at least try to read some more in that space. Now let's talk about book length, starting with the longest audiobook I read in the second quarter. This might not be a surprise just based off logic, but because the first week of Tome Topple was at the very tail end of the second quarter, it should be no surprise that my longest audiobook was A Taste of Golden Iron by Alexandra Rowland, which has a runtime of 18 hours and 20 minutes. That absolutely blows last quarter's longest audiobook out of the water. I believe it was All We Were Promised, which was just under 13 hours, but no other audiobook this quarter even remotely comes close. The closest one was Womb City, which was roughly 16 and a half hours long, despite the fact that it's only 84 pages shorter than A Taste of Gold and Iron. The longest book I read in terms of page count, regardless of the format, was also, unsurprisingly, A Taste of Gold and Iron, which was an even 500 pages. And the second longest was Asunder by Kirsten Hall, which was 432 pages. This next stat isn't quite as interesting or dynamic as it was last quarter, but let's talk about my most read authors of the second quarter. By default, this one goes to Charlotte Bond because I read both currently published and soon-to-be published books in the Fireborn Blade series. I do think it's interesting, though, that Charlotte Bond was the only repeat author for this quarter, because that means I read books that were written by 24 unique authors. In terms of star rating, my average star rating for the second quarter was 4.13 stars. That's actually ever so slightly down from last quarter, but like I said in my last quarterly stats video, I'm actually good with having a higher average rating. Some people might interpret that as not being critical enough, but honestly it just shows me that I have a very good understanding of my reading taste and that I'm really good at being selective and picking out books that I think I have a really good chance of enjoying, which is entirely the point. I actually don't want to waste my time reading books that I don't like. And related to that, unsurprisingly, my most used rating of the second quarter was 4.5 stars. I gave 9 books 4.5 stars. Next, we have another new category that I wanted to look into. I wanted to see which publishers I'm reading from the most. I have to say, very generally speaking, it doesn't really matter to me who is publishing a book. That's never going to be one of the top deciding factors when it comes to choosing what I read. I do have a good sense of who publishes things I tend to enjoy, but I care more about what the story's about, who the author is, what the book represents, as opposed to anything else. But I still think it's good to be conscious of which publishers we read from and platform, and where our dollars or engagement or social capital is going. By the way, this is only counting publishers I read more than 2 books from. So going from least read to most read, surprisingly, Penguin Random House is tied for one of my least read publishers of the quarter. I only read 3 books published under Penguin imprints. Also sitting at 3 books is Simon & Schuster, and I mostly credit that to Saga Press. I was pleasantly surprised to see that indie, self-published, and small press books took second place in this ranking with a combined total of 4 books. And in what is absolutely no surprise to me, the publisher I read from the most in the second quarter was Macmillan. I read 12 of their books. Again, this is not a shock to me personally, especially with fantasy being my most read genre of the quarter. It stands to reason that a good chunk of those come from Tor and Tor.com. We also can't forget that Macmillan has imprints like FSG, MCD, Flatiron, Fievel and Friends, so they're just a powerhouse. Next, I want to dive into another new category, which is how many books I read from new to me authors. There are so many incredible books being published by new authors literally every week, and while we all have our tried and true favorites we return to time and time again, I also like to make space for up-and-coming voices. So I was very curious about this and pleasantly surprised to see that in the second quarter I read 17 new to me authors. Let's break that down a little bit further. Of those 17 authors, 8 of them were debut authors. That includes Sierra Birch, Yume Kitase, at least at the time of reading. I know she has since released a second book. Also Hana Lee, Ann Zhao, Park Sol-yeon, Ling Huang, Michael Waters, and Elaine Yu Cho. And of those 17 new to me authors, 9 of them were authors I had never read from before, but who had been previously published, whether in short fiction, poetry, or other books I simply had not read. Those authors include Tlotlo Tomase, Yasmin Amuarata, Nadia Shamas and Sarah Alfagi, Neil Cochran, Sasha Stronach, Kirsten Hall, Charlotte Bond, and Alexandra Rowland. Again, I love this. It makes me very happy that new to me authors made up over half of my reading this past quarter. Now, I don't know if this next stat is necessarily important, but it is something I've been logging on my reading spreadsheet, so I might as well share, and that is predominant colors on book covers. So if anyone cares to know, the most popular cover color of quarter 2 was definitely purple. I read 6 books with predominantly purple cover designs. No other color was even remotely close. Penultimately, we have to check in and see how much money I saved at the library this quarter. I love my library, I use it often, I use it proudly, I do not take it for granted. I do have to say though, this quarter was a little bit light on the library checkouts. I don't think that's inherently a bad thing, it just means I was reading things I already owned and that I was mostly using the library to fill in a few gaps. So I actually only checked out 4 things from the library this past quarter, 3 physical books and 1 audiobook, but that did still save me a cool $95.56, which is huge. Last quarter I checked out 7 books in various formats and saved almost $150, so it's kind of wild to me that I checked out significantly less books and still almost cracked $100 in savings. And the big headline is that overall this year I've saved a total of $244.53. Obviously, I would like to see my library usage increase a little bit the next quarter, but we'll see what happens. Last quarter, I ended with my top 5 books of the quarter, so let's get into it. As always, this was an excruciating choice to make, especially because I read so many great books this past quarter. I thought about just going with my 5-star books, but I honestly read so many new favorites that were just shy of 5 stars, and that doesn't mean my love for them is any less. But anyways, going in chronological order, my first favorite book of the second quarter was The Haunting of Tramcar 015 by P. Djeli Clark. I've said so many times that this is the year of P. Djeli Clark, and I meant it. For anyone who might not know, P. Djeli Clark has only published 1 full-length adult novel at this time, which is A Master of Jinn, and he has a series of short works leading up to it that are optional but also supplementary to the Dead Jinn universe. There are 2 short stories and 1 novella, which is this book. It's a steampunk historical fantasy set in an alternate Cairo where deities and otherworldly creatures live alongside humans. As you would expect, it's not a perfectly symbiotic relationship. There are incidents between species, which resulted in the creation of the Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments, and Supernatural Entities. It's their job to sort out those cases. In this novella, we're following Senior Agent Hamed El Nasir, who's a veteran at the agency. He just got saddled with a rookie partner, and while he's trying to show his partner the ropes, they receive a call about a tramcar that may or may not be possessed by a dangerous spirit. Again, this is a novella that comes in at just around 130 pages, and it has no business being as good as it is. The reason why this really stands out to me is not only because it blends historical fiction, steampunk, fantasy, mystery, and horror in new and compelling ways, but because it flips the entire concept of a haunting on its head. I said all this in my April wrap-up, but I deeply respect how the author forces the reader to reconsider our presumptions of where we place the label of evil and innocent when it comes to horror stories, and how the power dynamics between humans and spirits, or more broadly between the banisher and the banished, is much more fraught than we might think. This novella and the short works preceding it are nothing short of phenomenal, and I am ready to read A Master of Jinn. Next is You Should Be So Lucky by Cat Sebastian. Cat Sebastian is a national treasure. The way she's able to write historical romance that's so tender, so thoughtful, and so incredibly joyful is just second to none. This is a companion novel to We Could Be So Good, which you should also read if you haven't. They both stand on their own. You don't have to read one before the other, but the characters from the first book do make some appearances in this second book. This is a slow burn, queer historical sports romance about Eddie, a professional baseball player who just got traded to a new team and is now in the biggest hitting slump of his life. And it's also about Mark, who's just filling in as a sports reporter and gets assigned a weekly feature where he interviews this new player and releases those interviews as a series of baseball diaries. I don't need to say anything else. Obviously, they fall in love. It's fantastic. What keeps me thinking about this book is that even though it's undeniably a rom-com, it's very much a story about grief. Both characters are dealing with grief in very different ways. Mark's long-term partner passed away a year before the story begins, and he doesn't know whether he has it in him to be with anyone else. And Eddie is grieving his inability to play this sport he loves so deeply and that used to come to him so naturally but no longer does. The story is such a beautiful testimony to how these two kinds of grief, no matter how different they might seem, are intricately connected. And that makes the romance that much sweeter, that much more beautiful, that much more fulfilling, because the characters aren't just trying to make their way to each other, but they're also trying to make their way back to themselves. And even though the story is unquestionably about grief and gives those moments the weight they deserve, it is also undoubtedly joyful and hopeful in more ways than I can express. My next top favorite read of the quarter was Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang. This is a queer contemporary horror story about a young musician whose parents are Chinese immigrants. She's a prolific piano player who has trained for years, but when her parents are in an accident and have to be sent to a care facility full-time, she gives up her future to work at this glamorous beauty and wellness store that caters to the rich. The store is called Holistic, and it's known for its cutting-edge products and procedures that almost seem to magically keep their clientele looking forever youthful. And it isn't until the main character is given free sample products and strongly encouraged to use them herself that she realizes something profoundly sinister is behind this company's success. This is one of those books that I just cannot shake. It's weird, it's disturbing, it's off-putting, but in a way that brilliantly serves the story. It's masterfully written, and it forces the reader to interrogate the pervasiveness of impossible beauty standards. Not to mention how Western beauty standards uphold Eurocentric values of beauty and attractiveness that will never neatly map onto people whose bodies exist outside of and beyond that deeply colonized space, which of course is entirely the point. What I loved about the body horror elements of this story especially is the fact that there's no big bad. There's no real villain, there's no monster, there's no magical force, there's no easily traceable source of this body morphine phenomenon. It's a culture, it's systemic. This story is a very literal take on the concept of women specifically contorting themselves into these unattainable shapes and expectations in the desperate hope of leveraging their individuality and their well-being as currency in exchange for acceptance. And of course, it does it in a way that's delightfully horrific. This is a fever dream of a story that I cannot recommend highly enough. Then, of course, we have to talk about Fire Exit by Morgan Talty. This is Morgan Talty's first full-length novel. He wrote an incredible short story collection called Night of the Living Rez that I always recommend, but this one is about a man named Charles who lives across the river from the Penobscot Reservation in Maine, watching his only daughter from afar as she grows up without him in her life. Because of blood quantum law, Charles and the mother decided he would not be legally declared the father because that would actually prevent their daughter from legally claiming her indigenous heritage. Not only is Charles extremely lonely, recovering from an alcohol addiction, and struggling as the sole caretaker for his mother living with dementia, but just when he decides to come clean to his daughter, he notices that he hasn't actually seen her across the river in 2 weeks. To just say this is an incredible story is a huge undersell and a profound disservice to what Morgan Talty has achieved here. This is an intensely human and thought-provoking exploration of all the different ways that we are denied our humanity and unfettered access to the depths of our histories. It's a love letter to how history is a collective, ongoing project, a tapestry that we're creating together with all the people in our communities and in our lives, whether by choice or by circumstance, and how we have to reconcile all those different contributions. This is one of those books where I was only a few pages into it and I already knew it was going to be something truly extraordinary, and it absolutely was. The fifth and final spot in my top 5 was extremely contentious because I had an amazing reading month in June. This very easily could have gone to The Other Olympians, Rough Trade, or even A Taste of Golden Iron, but the story my gut kept kept returning to was Asunder by Kirsten Hall. This is a standalone fantasy horror story about Karis Eska, who sold her soul and her body to an eldritch monster in exchange for the ability to death speak or communicate with the recently deceased. She uses this magic to investigate suspicious deaths around the city, and one such investigation leads her to stumble upon a horrific new species of monster, a political conspiracy, and a dying stranger, someone she ends up accidentally bonding herself to and who might be her only chance of uncovering the truth. I'm trying to talk about this book in a way that's not just me being super messy, but I can't help it. This book definitely messed me up and it got under my skin. It's dark, it's gritty, it has mystery, it has horror and body horror in spades, but it's also contrasted by this whimsical sense of adventure and some deeply emotional relationships. There's a thread of romance also holding everything taut and together through this ceaseless yearning that connects those two characters and that can never quite be bridged. It's torturous, but it keeps you hoping against hope for whatever might come next. And I think what hit me the most about this story is that it takes Karis on an unforgettable journey of growth as she changes from this toxically independent person who trusts no one besides herself to having her world open up and learn that she deserves to hope and to fight for herself even when it seems like the world is at its most hopeless. This just really made me feel so many things, and it also blends two of my favorite genres, fantasy and horror, in really exciting ways. This book comes out in August, and I really hope a lot of people get a chance to pick it up because I need so much more from Kirsten Hall. So those are my standouts from the second quarter and all my reading stats from last quarter as well, at least the important ones. I hope you found this interesting and feel free to drop some of your own stats or recent favorites down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.